So anyway, so my name is Felipe de Brigard, and I'm a professor here at Duke University, where I teach in several departments, mainly in the philosophy department and the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience. I am primarily a memory researcher, so I came to this project of thinking about forgiveness through the route of memory. So let me tell you a little bit about what I do and why I ended up doing what I'm doing. So a lot of my work has been on false memories. Many of you are probably familiar with the phenomena for false memory, which is when people wrongly think that they are remembering something that actually never happened. Most research on false memory focuses on the negative aspects of false memories, like when people, for instance, misidentify a perpetrator of a crime and so forth. I have done in the past decade a lot of work on the fact that trying to understand why memory is reconstructive in this particular way, why memory is so prone to give us false information. And a lot of my work has been trying to argue, as well as the many other people who work on memory, that memory is really not for reproduction with fidelity, but rather it is for engaging in mental simulations of hypothetical thoughts, including episodic future thoughts and my own favorite one, episodic counterfactual thinking. And a lot of this research line suggests very strongly that memory and imagination interact in many different ways, and that interaction occurs particularly at retrieval. But as I mentioned, most of this research has focused on the negative consequences of this interaction. And I want to ask sort of a foundational question, which is, why does this interaction occur to begin with? And in turn, could it be possible that we can leverage this interaction for positive future consequences? The kernel of this idea started almost a decade ago when I was finishing my postdoc, in which I was interested in this phenomena that when you repeat an episodic simulation, you tend normally to think that it is more plausible, that it is easier or more detailed. However, there is a particular kind of episodic simulation, namely episodic factual thoughts about alternative ways in which past events could have occurred, that are different from other kinds of imaginations, because when we imagine what could have happened, we also have to contrast it with what actually happened. So in this experiment, I was curious to see whether repeated simulation would also increase the detail and the ease with which counterfactual thoughts were retrieved. And what we discover is that just as with any other kind of episodic simulation, the detail and the ease of the counterfactual increases, but the plausibility, that is to say, how likely do you think that the event could have occurred, tends to decrease. And at that point, I explained this effect in terms of what I call the coming to grips with the past. The idea is that our brains are basically not designed to spend a lot of energy into thinking of what ifs that we deemed unlikely, and rather we want to spend more time into thinking of what ifs that we deem are plausible. But of course, that was just the beginning of a question for me. I wanted to understand, I'm a cognitive scientist, so I wanted to understand why is it that there is this reduction in our perceived plausibility, even though the detail and the ease of the simulation increases. And at this point, I started to sort of hypothesize that what might be going on is that our imagination is interacting with our memories at the level of the reconsolidation. So according to the traditional view of memory, we had it that once the memory is encoded and the process of encoding is unstable, nevertheless, the thought was that once the memory is consolidated after the encoding, that memory is stable. Tell me that. Let me see. Can you see the screen now? Sorry, guys, I don't know what's going on with the screen sharing. On my end, it says that the screen is being shared, no problem.
Yes, we can see.
Let's All right, I don't know if you can see. Okay, good. So sorry about that. I have no idea what was going on. All right, so it looks like here's where I was. So basically what I was trying to say is that according to the traditional view of memory, once the memory is consolidated, it is supposed to be stable and impervious to modification. Nevertheless, in the last 2 or 3 decades, maybe now, there's been a lot of interest in the fact that once the memory is reactivated, it is actually prone to modification. And there are lots of different ways in which people have modified the memories after retrieval. They have done it by behavioral means, with different kinds of stressor event, pharmacological interventions, and so forth. The end result is that if the memory is modified in the process of reconsolidation, or in this window between reconciliation, you can actually alter the original content of the memory. So with this sort of background in mind, I started to do a lot of work using counterfactual thinking as an emotional strategy to reappraise the emotion of original autobiographical memories. Shortly after I got to Duke, I got a big grant in 2014 or 15, in which we were basically exploring not only the neural basis, but also the cognitive and behavioral basis of engaging in counterfactual thinking during memory reactivation of negative memories. And in particular, we were focused on work with individuals with anxiety, because individuals with anxiety tend to ruminate over what ifs in a way that it is highly maladaptive. So I'm not going to go on all the results of this background experience, just to mention one of my favorite ones here, which is, so for instance, individuals with generalized anxiety disorder tend to regret ever more so than neurotypicals. And as a result of that, they engage in a number of cognitive behavioral therapies. One of the cognitive behavioral therapy we basically show is that counterfactual thinking actually is better than temporal distancing in reducing feelings of regret as a function of trait anxiety. So slowly it was very clear that maybe we were a real phenomenon that we could so this led me to another set of further thoughts. We use imagination to modify the effective contents of previous autobiographical experiences so that we can more easily carry our past. And the thought is that we can actually use counterfactual thinking during memory reactivation for the better, for improving our memories. And this was a big proof of concept of the use of counterfactual thinking as an emotional reappraisal strategy during the memory reactivation. Now, fast forward a few years to like 2019 or so, 17, 18, I started to think about other psychological states that can help us to modify the contents of negative autobiographical memories for the better. And of course, as many Colombians back then, I was profoundly excited and interested in trying to figure out how to contribute to the peace process back then. And it started to occur to me at this point that maybe forgiveness as a psychological phenomenon is actually supported by a mechanism similar to that of emotional reappraisal. So I started doing a little bit of research on that, and it turns out that there was pretty much none. So I wanted to explore a little bit more about what is the relationship between memory and forgiveness. So I wanted to generate, a big project. violence in Colombia. So to be able to get the project up and running, I needed two things. First, I needed to gather pilot data to show that the project was feasible, and I also needed to gather a team to show that the project was possible. So what I want to do for the rest of this 15 minutes is to basically tell you a little bit about the feasibility and the possibility of this project. So as with sorry, it looks like is it working now? I'm trying to share my screen again. Andres, can you tell me if it's working or not? Can you see my presentation and can you hear me? Okay, so I'm glad that you can hear me, but my screen says that I am sharing the presentation. Is it working now? I'm gonna stop sharing and I'm gonna try sharing again. Is it working? Okay, I have no idea who to believe. Andres says that you can not see. Okay, all right. I'm going to assume that it is working. The people in the chat says that it is working, and Andres, you're telling me that it is not working. So I'm not sure. Okay, I am going to continue assuming that it is working. So in terms of feasibility, I was mentioning we did an experiment. We did a series of experiments to try to just basically test the following hypothesis. And this was conducted by my graduate student, Gabriela Fernandez, postdoc Sam Murray, former grad student, Matt Stanley, and current grad student, Leonard Paul. All right, So basically, just to give you a little bit of a background, there is a background on emotional accounts of forgiveness that trace back to Bishop Joseph Butler's sermons on forgiveness. And according to this emotional account of forgiveness, to forgive involves the forswearing or the overcoming of resentment. Now, in the last 20 years or so, there's been a lot of controversy as to how exactly this changing heart and why it occurs. So one very sort of influential response to this question came from Pamela Hayanomi in 2001, who suggested that the reason why this emotional change happens is because we have first a cognitive change. We revise our judgment about the perpetrator, and we think that the perpetrator is no longer responsible or blameworthy for the action. Now, this generated, of course, a huge problem because sometimes it's called the paradox of forgiveness. Because how is it possible that we want to forgive someone who is now deemed no longer blameworthy? So there's a lot of philosophical discussion as to how to solve this problem, but there is, let's see, for our purposes, there are these two opposing views that suggest different answers. One possibility, which was suggested by Bloomstein, is that the reason why we change our emotion is because we actually forget the details of the wrongdoing. And this change in forgetting, in the change in forgiving is due to the change in forgetting. By contrast, Santiago Maya, professor in the University of Los Andes and collaborator in this team, I will talk about him in a second, suggests instead that what is happening is that we actually do have something like an emotional distancing, which is again one strategy of the appraisal. So it's not that we forget the event. What happens is that we reappraise the emotion that we attach to the event. So in this pilot set of experiments, what I wanted to do was basically to contrast these two views, the cognitive forgetting view and the emotional reappraisal view, against one another. The experiments are extremely simple. I am not going to go over all of the results. I'm simply going to give you a very general idea. And what we sought to do with this was to identify differences in the experience of autobiographical recollections of past wrongdoings, depending on whether or not the perpetrator has been forgiven. We wanted to test whether these potential differences are actually due to changes in the cognitive and or in the affective content of the original memory of the wrongdoing. Again, by cognitive contents, I refer to how well people remember the actual situation, the people that were there, the colors, and so forth. By contrast, the affective content is the content, the emotional content that is associated to the memory itself. Finally, we wanted to see if we could explore differences in the experience of remembering past personal wrongdoings and whether they could predict our tendency to forgiveness, benevolence, and revenge. So we conducted a total of 5 studies in the United States, comprising a total of 1,229 participants. So just a very general idea of how the experiments go, because this is pretty much the same structure for the experiments. They're normally between subjects. We ask them simply to recall an event in which someone else harmed them emotionally or physically in the past 10 years. And we randomly assign participants to one of 2 conditions, a condition in which they forgave the perpetrator or a condition in which participants did not forgive the perpetrator. We asked them simply to write 4 to 6 sentences on the event, and then we use some DV, some dependent variable. And for instance, in experiment 1, we use a dependent variable that measures how important is this event in your autobiographical mind. So what we expected to see here is that if people haven't forgiven the perpetrator, then they tend to think of that event as being more central to their lives than if they have forgiven. And this is exactly what we find. We find that victims who forgave the perpetrator evaluated the wrongdoing as less central to their identity and as less important to their current lives relative to those that did not forgive. There are other scales that people employ to explore the phenomenology of our autobiographical memories. One of the most famous ones, developed in the 1980s by Marshall Johnson, is called the Memory Characteristics Questionnaire. And here we can easily distinguish between the cognitive versus the emotional components. Our hypothesis is that there are not going to be any differences in the cognitive components of forgiven versus unforgiven wrongdoings. But instead, what we should be seeing is differences in how people feel about those memories at the time of retrieval. And that's exactly what we find. We find that there are no differences in the cognitive components of forgiven versus unforgiven wrongdoings. We also see that there is no difference in the valence that people attach to the event when it happened. However, at the time of retrieval, we feel that people that have forgiven tend to experience the memory with a more positive valence than those who have not forgiven. Likewise, when it comes to intensity, we see that people don't have any difference attributed to the intensity of the event back then, but at the time of retrieval, we see that there is a difference, and people who have forgiven their perpetrators tend to experience this event with less intensity than those that have not forgiven the event. We also see a difference in how much people think about the event. Those that have forgiven the perpetrator tend to think and ruminate about the event less so than those that have not forgiven the perpetrators. Another of the several studies that we conducted here, we used these differences in emotion forgiveness to actually predict 3 dimensions of forgiveness. One dimension is revenge. To what extent do you want to experience revenge? Another dimension is avoidance. To what extent do you want to avoid the perpetrator? And benevolence. To what extent do you now feel feelings of benevolence toward the perpetrator? And what we see is that not only avoidance and revenge tendencies are significantly higher for not forgiven versus forgiven perpetrators, but we also see that the feelings of benevolence are lower and that the valence and the intensity during recollection predicted all these differences. So we're now seeing memory predicting differences in forgiveness measures. Another of the fun results of this series of studies is that we explore how your perceived severity of the wrongdoing is, and how close you are to the perpetrator. The perpetrator could be someone that you knew very closely or someone that you never knew before. And what we see here, this is a 3-way interaction. So I just try to briefly get to the point, but basically what we see here is that the tendency toward benevolence goes down as the perceived severity of the wrongdoing increases. But in the forgiveness condition, this reduction is actually less steep than in the no forgiveness condition. And this slope reduces even more as the victim's relationship with the perpetrator is closer. So when you can see for instance, here in the forgiveness condition, there is this flat yellow line. Once you have forgiven the perpetrator, there is basically no difference in your benevolence toward that individual, regardless of the severity. However, if you're not forgiving that perpetrator, you see this very steep incline. And with people that are very close to you, you end up feeling way less benevolent to that. So this is as close as you can get to anything relatively causal or moderating, at least, in the process of forgiveness. So anyways, so the thought here, just to summarize, is that autobiographical memories of forgiven wrongdoings are experienced as less negatively, less intensely, less central to one's life and identity, and are ruminated upon less relative to those of unforgiven wrongdoings. And that this effect is only evident for memories in which one is the victim and not the perpetrator. And that forgiving the perpetrator correlated with increased levels of benevolence toward them and reduced the sense of revenge and avoidance. And we show it in this series of studies too, that these associations are actually modulated by the perceived severity of the wrongdoing, as well as how close the victim is to the perpetrator. So this is great news for me. We had a proof of concept that memory, that emotional memory is associated with forgiveness ever more so than unforgiveness wrongdoings. So what we needed to do now was to actually test it in the victims of political violence in Colombia and compare it with different kinds of populations and doing more massively with different DVs and so forth. But to do that, I needed a team and a grant. So I was very lucky to set up one of the most amazing teams ever. So I have my co-investigators, Professor Santiago Amaya, who's a professor of philosophy at the University of Los Andes. He might or might not be listening to this right now. Professor Pablo Vidbol, from whom you're going to hear later on, who has been working on peace and memory in Montes de Maria and for many, many years, Cartagena también. And also Professor Luisa Lopez, who's coming to talk, I think, tomorrow or maybe later today, And here in the US, my colleague Kevin Dabar, who is a cognitive neuroscientist who works on emotion and memory, has been published widely on those topics. And philosophy professor Lucy Elias, who's currently a professor in both South Africa and in Johns Hopkins, and has done a lot of work on forgiveness and also during the apartheid. So that's this amazing team of co-investigators. And we needed to find a suitable population. So we are working, thanks to the leadership of Paulo, with a population of victims in Montes de Maria. And a lot of this research is conducted out of partly in Universidad Javeriana and partly in Cartagena and la Universidad Tecnológica de Bolívar. So we wrote the grant and we've got it, thanks to the John Templeton Foundation, who thought that the idea was sufficiently worth exploring. We got the grant about 10 months ago, and we started now. We just got IRP approved, and there's a bunch of projects that are just basically starting right now. Just to introduce you a little bit about the rest of the team, some postdoc, Gabriela, grad student I mentioned, but also we have a number of RAs currently working in Cartagena and in Bogota who are helping us to collect the data. The grant involves 9 experiments with different kinds of DVs. There are a number of other members of the team that are yet to be announced. But one of the things that that this project has as a goal is actually to improve science and experimentation in Colombia, and particularly at the Universidad Tecnológica de Bolívar. So one of the things that we are doing, I should update this slide because we actually have the equipment now, is that we're actually creating the first biophysiology lab at the Universidad Tecnológica de Bolívar. One of the experiments involves physiological reactions as a function of forgiveness versus unforgiveness. And another big aim of the project is to involve victims and perpetrators eventually in the process of doing science and philosophy in Colombia. We work very closely with the community also to help to identify mental health needs. And the idea is that the results, we hope, of all of this research can contribute to the Justicia Especial de Paz. This is a nice picture of the team from La Canzona looking down at Carmen de Oliva. Thanks to you for listening. I hope that at least you got to hear some of what I was presenting.